Welcome to the Queen's public hearing on the proposed fiscal year 2016 New York City water rates. My name is Eric Landau, and I'll serve as the hearing officer for tonight's meeting. I'd like to take just a minute to give a brief overview of this evening's process. First, I'd like to thank LaGuardia Community College for hosting us. Second, please note that we place certain documents into the official record. The notice designated me as the hearing officer. A copy of the public notice listing this hearing and an affidavit of publication of such notice. The draft of the proposed water and wastewater rate schedule. Public information booklet regarding water and wastewater rates, a copy of which is available up front at the registration table, and all written statements submitted to the water board. These items are marked Exhibits 1 through 5. In just a moment, we will hear a presentation from New York City Department of Environmental Protection Commissioner Emily Lloyd on the water rate proposal, and then we'll open up the meeting to hear from you, the members of the public. I'd also like to acknowledge and introduce Mike Moran from DEP's Bureau of Customer Service. Mike and other DEP staff are on hand this evening to answer any specific questions that anyone may have about their account. If you have not yet signed up to speak, but would like to do so, please take a moment at any point, and you may sign up at the registration table. Please know that you can also submit written testimony to the New York City Water Board up until the close of business this Friday, May 1st. These statements will be entered into the record, and copies will be distributed to the Water Board members prior to their adoption of a rate schedule for fiscal year 2016. I'd like to introduce the individuals joining me here. To my right, Alfonso Carney, Chairman of the New York City Water Board. Our Water Board members joining us this evening, Adam Freed, Jonathan Golden, and Arlene Shaw. New York City Water Board Executive Director Steve Lotz, and Treasurer Matthiel McLean. Mr. Chairman, do you have anything to add before we begin?
Just a few things. Very brief, Eric. Thank you. Thank you all for coming, those of you who have come out for the public hearing. You could have used the time very differently. Those of you who have decided to come out and turn out small tonight could have been doing other things. You didn't. You decided to come here. We're grateful to see you. You all know that what we deal with is a very complex water and wastewater system. It is the job of this board to make sure that the systems are operated, protected, and improved in a manner that is both effective and efficient. A big part of our job, therefore, is to listen to what the public has to say, and we have an opportunity to do that once a year in each of the 5 boroughs. We want to hear from those of you who have come. We'll hope that others come in before the presentation is done. DEP Commissioner Lloyd is here to make the presentation. Please listen to her very carefully, and then it's your turn to talk. And the idea is that she will finish her presentation, and then you all, anybody who wants to speak can. For your information, this is the 4th hearing, the 4th of 5 public hearings. We were in Staten Island on Monday, Brooklyn on Tuesday, and the Bronx last night. We, of course, are here tonight, and we'll be in Manhattan tomorrow afternoon. Again, thank you for coming, those of you who have come out. Commissioner Lloyd, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and apologies for the noisy mic. So I have a presentation that tries to address what the water rate pays for, how we put together a recommendation for the Water Board, and I will go through it quickly for the record, and hope that I will not impose too much on the time of those of you who have come. The proposed rate for this year is an increase of 3.24%. We always hope that we will be able to recommend no rate increase after some very significant increases over the past few years, which we'll talk about in a minute. It is a much smaller increase, which we're relieved about. For a single-family homeowner, it would be a difference of about $33 a year, and for multi-family dwellings, it would be somewhere between $22 and $31 a year per unit. Just a word about what the water rate pays for. We're a standalone agency. All the water that supports the water, all the money that supports the water and wastewater system is paid by ratepayers. What it covers is the water supply of 1.1 billion gallons a day. We manage a 2,000 square mile watershed upstate with dams, aqueducts, reservoirs, And the wastewater treatment system treats about 1.2 billion gallons of wastewater a day through 14 wastewater treatment plants and about 148,000 catch basins, as well as a growing network of green infrastructure. The big drivers of the cost of operating the water and wastewater system are really four things. One, first of all, mandates, things that we are required to do by regulators. The second is the fact that we have an aging infrastructure. The Croton system was built in the 1840s. Our oldest water mains are over 100 years old, and Water Tunnel 1, which is the backbone of water delivery through the Bronx and Manhattan, was built in 1917 and has been in continuous service since. We also have really still an incomplete system, particularly our storm sewers through Queens, Southeast Queens, South Brooklyn, and Staten Island have not been fully built out. And increasingly, we are also investing to cope with climate change, particularly wastewater infrastructure to deal with more frequent, more intense rain, sewer system supplements to deal with cloudbursts, and preparing for periods of extreme drought, which we also expect. Just a word about what those mandates are. First of all, the first big one, there are two of them, is the Safe Drinking Water Act that was built in 1974, which sets standards that are for the entire country. And in particular, we are required to treat against two types of bacteria which are deadly if they get into distribution. And some of our biggest projects have been to fulfill this mandate. We are required to filter the water from east of the Hudson, and we are just completing a filtration plant to handle that Croton water. We would have to build a plant for the 90% of the water west of Hudson if we did not keep the water clean, so we have been required to invest heavily in what's called the filtration avoidant determination, where we regulate the upstate. We've built or upgraded over 100 wastewater treatment plants, replaced or upgraded over 4,000 septic systems up in the watershed, and installed almost 7,000 best management practices in farms to keep runoff from the farms, both from animal waste and fertilizers, from polluting the water. We also have just built a disinfection plant for the water from west of the Hudson. On the surrounding water side, the Clean Water Act sets as a national goal water quality that provides for the protection and propagation of fish, shellfish, wildlife, and provides for recreation in and on the water. That applies to the waters of the U.S., so it's all the waters around the city of New York, and we're many boroughs surrounded by water, and we increasingly, that's interpreted to mean having that water be suitable for swimming. So we are really struggling to catch up with that requirement. We've built some very large treatment plants, particularly the Newtown Creek plant, which you see from the Long Island Expressway as you approach Manhattan. We have a very extensive nitrogen removal system to keep nitrogen from degrading the quality of Long Island Sound and Jamaica Bay. And we are in the process of building out long-term control plans for controlling combined sewer overflows into the surrounding waters. In Queens, we have plans for Alley Creek, Flushing Creek, Flushing Bay, and Jamaica Bay and all its tributaries. We have seen over the past 30 years a significant improvement in water quality around New York City. If you look at 1985, everything in red and yellow was not suitable for recreational use or for swimming. And if you look at 2013, you can see that almost all the water is now, with the exception of some of the small tributaries that were used for industrial use and by and large don't flush naturally either through rivers coming into them or through tidal movement. And these are the ones that we are in the last stages of making plans to clean up. We also, just to quickly mention some of the operating costs associated with compliance with these two acts. They cut across everything we do. Just to mention two, we perform every year over 1 million analyses on both the drinking water and the stormwater and wastewater. We maintain 5 drinking water labs and 4 harbor quality labs as well. Moving on to the investment we make in the aging infrastructure. I mentioned Water Tunnel 1 that has been in continuous operation since 1917. Water Tunnel 2 serving Brooklyn and Queens has been in continuous operation since 1937. And since 1973, the city has been building a 3rd water tunnel to allow us to take those original tunnels offline for inspection and repairs. We've completed the Bronx and Manhattan parts of that, and hope to bring the Brooklyn Queens part on over the next 10 to 12 years. The Manhattan part will also, in the not too distant future, provide the water going into Staten Island. We also are repairing leaks in the Delaware Aqueduct. That's the aqueduct upstate that brings us 50% of the water to the city. It's been leaking, and we've been concerned that there was a risk that it might fail at some point. So we have a very ambitious program underway to build a bypass tunnel under the Hudson River that we will switch over to probably in the early 2020s. We also are strengthening our dams upstate in anticipation of more severe storms. We're completing a major upgrade to the Balboa Dam in Schoharie County, and in the next budget we have money to strengthen the dams at the Ashokan Reservoir. We also have a high priority accelerated water main replacement program for some of our oldest water mains, where when we think, because we start to see leaks, that they are becoming fragile, which the old cast iron water mains do, we are going in and trying to replace them fairly quickly. We generally do the sewers at the same time and try to work with either Con Ed or National Grid to have them upgrade their gas infrastructure at the same time. And finally, looking at system completion, there are 2 major aspects of this. One is we want to make sure where we have conveyance bringing water to the city, that we always are able to maintain an adequate supply of water to the city. And we have now a missing piece of infrastructure between Kensico Reservoir and our Eastview facility of disinfection that treats 90% of our water. So we are constructing a 2nd tunnel. We used to have one. It doesn't work with the new ultraviolet facility, and so now we're constructing that 2nd tunnel. And then I mentioned also building out the storm sewer system in the parts of the city that got developed quickly in the second half of the 20th century, and we are catching up, and we are increasingly supplementing that with green infrastructure such as Blue Belt. So we talk a lot about the mandates and a lot about our capital expenditures because it's such a big part of what drives the water rate. So just if you'll look to get a sense of how that breaks down, on the right are the mandated projects, the both drinking water and the clean water projects, and that's about 47% of our debt. We have about $40 billion in capital projects that we've built over the past 30 years. 47% mandated projects, and the rest fall into those other categories that I mentioned. To put this in context, we're always looking at other cities around the country, looking at what they're doing, trying to understand, first of all, that the regulators, are our regulators being tougher on us than regulators are around the country, and we have seen that generally they're not. You can see from this chart, which shows water rates at the 30 largest cities over the past about 30 years, and the ones that are in bright colors are the cities that we have most in common with in terms of our infrastructure. We're sort of in the middle of the pack. Overall, the average increase over those years has been 6.3%, an average a year. Ours is 6.8%, so we're a little bit ahead. But what you see there, and the way the lines go up, is that all of the cities have resisted for a long time making some of the big investments. Everybody, I think, embraced the goals on the clean water side, but was concerned about the expense. Most water utilities are supported by the ratepayers, so people postponed it as long as they could. and then had to, over the past about 15 years, play catch up as the regulators got tougher. Just to give you a sense, if we don't come into compliance on some of these major mandates, we can pay fines that can be between $10 and $14 million a year. So ultimately, it's less expensive to build the projects than it is to pay the fines over time. The Croton filtration plant that I mentioned is going to be opening in May. If we do not open it on May 17th, we will pay a fine of $65 million. So the regulators are very tough about our getting this work done. Just to give you a sense, I said we're just a tiny bit above the national average in terms of the rate at which the average rate at which our rates have increased. You can see here the green line in the middle is the water rate, the typical average water rate charge for the 30 largest cities, and you'll see that we're just slightly below the national average. So even though we've increased our rates a lot the past few years, we're really just keeping the pace of what other cities across the country have had to do, which tells us that the regulators are not being harder on us and that our costs are tracking similarly to what everyone's having to do to come into compliance with these major laws. Another thing we like to look at, because we are very aware that any rate increase can be particularly difficult for small homeowners, for people managing affordable housing, for people who are not very affluent, and we try very hard to keep the rates as low as we can. And one thing we look at is how we compare to other monthly costs of New York City residents. And we see that compared to housing, compared to electricity, compared to natural gas, compared to heating oil, as you go from left to right, we are the only major monthly expense that is actually below the national average. So we are slightly heartened to see that we are, compared to other costs, we think making a fairly successful effort to keep the costs down. Switching for a minute to talk about the service we deliver. One of the things we've tried to do is to improve our relationship with our customers. We have about 836 ratepayers across the city. Every building, of course, has water service and sewer service. Over the past few years, we have been installing automated meter reading. That's something that most cities have done. It's very helpful because we don't have to get someone into a building to read the meter. It's done automatically, electronically, and that has reduced estimated bills by 81%, and as a result, we think reduced building disputes by 56%. Having that has also allowed us to put in place a leak notification program. So when we see a spike in a homeowner's or a property owner's use, we are able to let them know that we think there's a problem, and they can then quickly get that remedied so they do not have a spiraling bill that they don't know is creating a problem. We also have a leak forgiveness program that we've been expanding, so that when people have a leak, see it, get it fixed, we will give them a credit if they do it in a timely way. And we also have put in place through a competitively selected vendor a service line protection program so that people, if they have a service line failure, which can be extremely expensive, can have that covered by a relatively low-cost insurance program that will pay for that service line replacement. On the operations side, we've been trying to fix things faster, and just to mention a couple, catch basin complaints were resolved 21% faster in 2015 compared to 2014 and year to date, and the average time to repair hydrants is improved by 22%. We've also had a program looking at all of our costs, trying to reduce all of our operating costs that we call OPEX for Operations Excellence, which has realized continuing savings of about $45 million through things like the reduction of chemical use, better energy efficiency, and restructuring of some of our work assignments. Looking ahead to capital priorities, you'll see there many of the projects that I've mentioned, they fall into those general categories. I think the overall thing is that we have a budget over the next 10 years that is approved in the January budget for $15.5 billion, and it is very focused on the long-term control plans I mentioned, the Delaware Aqueduct repair, green infrastructure, energy efficiency to come into compliance with the city's goal of an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2050, and other projects to build out the system, particularly in Southeast Queens and South Brooklyn and Staten Island, where the storm sewer is not fully built out. The city recently released a plan called One New York, which is focused on doing some major things to improve the quality of life and the infrastructure in the city. And a big part of that is a commitment to address flooding in Southeast Queens, which has become a much more difficult problem with the increased frequency and intensity of rainfall in the city. And the budget for that will be approved in the May 7th budget, executive budget that will go from the mayor's office to the city council and will include an intensive and accelerated long-term sewer build-out along with many specific, site-specific solutions to relieve flooding. Green infrastructure, just to elaborate on that a little bit because it's getting to be such an important part of the work that we do, we will be building 7,000 bioswales. That is again under a consent order to control combined sewer overflows. We are also working with the Parks Department, with New York City Housing Authority, and with the School Construction Authority, along with the Trust for Public Land, to install stormwater detention under as much public space, publicly owned space as we can, what we call the public realm, so that we're not just putting the water into the sewers, but trying to capture it as it comes out of the sky, the rainwater, and manage it without having it get into the wastewater treatment system. That's just a map of some of the green infrastructure in Queens. I will elaborate on that. And then just to talk a little bit about how all of this capital investment converts into how we evaluate the water rate that we recommend to the water board each year. Our capital projects are funded by the issuance of debt by the New York City Municipal Water Finance Authority, along with the water board. They are our partners in managing the water and wastewater system. When we have a project in our 10-year budget, we make a commitment. That means that money is put aside. We can't use it for anything but that project. Then as we start work on it, after it's been designed, when we start to do construction, we start to spend money, and as we spend money, we borrow money to pay for that. Because like a mortgage, we borrow money to pay for these big pieces of infrastructure. We borrow money generally for 30 years. The infrastructure will last for 50, 75, 100 years, as Water Tunnel 1 has now. But we limit ourselves at this point to 30-year debt, so we actually pay for it in less than the life of the project. But as we sell that, the debt then has to be paid. So for roughly every $100 million of capital project we spend money on, we pay about $5 million a year in debt service. So if you look at the lower left quadrant, more or less of that, you will see that that debt service is about 44% of what we spend every year. And that obviously becomes a big part of the water rate. It has become more significant over the years. We're working very hard to control that. We're looking at things like buying back some of the more expensive debt from years when interest rates were high and trading it in for lower interest debts, taking advantage of the low interest rates now. We are also doing more pay-as-you-go projects, paying for projects as we actually do them rather than borrowing money. And so as we look at 2016 with the Water Finance Authority, we project what we think our debt service will be. They look at our capital plan, tell us what they think it will cost us to borrow the money. And we also they look at what they think they might be able to do in terms of buying back more expensive debt. We also project out what we think our operating costs will be. That third line, you will see that our operating costs are going up about 8%. The big pieces of that are the labor settlements that have been outstanding for several years, and last year and this year, many of those labor agreements with the city are being settled. In addition, we're opening the Croton filtration plant with the energy and chemical costs associated with that. I mentioned also we will be expanding the nitrogen removal under a consent order. That's a very expensive program. And then we also, the next to bottom line, keep cash on hand equal to about 25% of our operating budget. It is a good operating practice in a water utility to keep about 15%. We keep 25% because we don't get any money from the general fund, from the city budget. So if we have an emergency, like I mentioned, one of the dams we're rebuilding, we, about 10 years ago, or must have been less than that, after Katrina, we looked at that dam and realized it might not be strong enough to withstand a storm of that size. We started doing emergency repairs right away. We had to have that cash in hand. After Sandy, we had to spend money immediately to get our wastewater treatment plants up and running. So we have to have cash in hand to deal with emergencies. So we keep that. We don't spend it on anything else. Whatever we don't use, and generally we don't use any of it, the first thing we do the next year is roll it over against the next year's budget, and we use it to pay our debt, which means that makes our bondholders very happy and keeps our interest rates low. You'll see at the bottom that our system costs this year are projected to be roughly the same as last year. So an obvious question, if the total system costs are going to be roughly the same, why are we requesting an increase in the water rate? So looking at this fairly complicated slide, if you look down the right-hand side, at the top are for 2016 what we project to be our total system costs. Out of that, we can deduct that carryover I mentioned. That's about $900 million. We also can deduct what we get paid by the people upstate. We have wholesale buyers that use our water. They pay us money, so we deduct that. And then in return, in addition, we also now are getting back 20% of the rent we pay the city for using the infrastructure that was built prior to the last 30 years. So we pay them that rent. They are giving us a credit back, and they're increasing that amount every year. So last year was 10%, next year is going to be 21%. So you'll see what we're getting back as a credit is going from $31 million to $41 million. So after you pay those against what we think the cost will be, we still have that bright yellow box. We still are going to need $3,640 million to operate. If you look at the sort of ochre box to the left of that, you will see our operating costs after we netted out those elements last year was about $3,582,000. So we do need some additional money this year. And if we had the same water rate this year as we had last year, it would yield us that $3,582 minus other costs. For example, we expect to collect less revenue because we have a very aggressive conservation program going on. We want to reduce water use before we have to shut down the Delaware Aqueduct to switch it over to the bypass tunnel. So we are encouraging people to use less water. We need to do that both for that project and because we expect to have droughts in the future. But the inevitable thing that goes with that is we bring in a little less revenue each year as we get people to conserve more water. So at last year's rate, with that projected amount of use, we would only be bringing in what you see in that green line in the middle. I may be able to do this. What you see in that line. But we need that bright yellow line. The difference is $114 million. And so in order to raise that $114 million to operate the system, we need to charge an additional 3.24%, and that's the rate that we are recommending to the Water Board that they are considering now and that we are soliciting your thoughts on. I did want to mention one other thing. We certainly realize that it is very difficult for people on fixed incomes, people who have lower incomes, but are homeowners to pay these rates. Last year we introduced a program where if you qualify for the HEAP program, which helps people pay for their heating in the winter, we also will give a return that's about 25% of the minimum charge for having water service, $116 a year is about 25% of that minimum charge. This year we're expanding that from about 12,500 households. It will go to about 59,000 households, which is about 7% of our ratepayers. We are expanding to cover all seniors and disabled people who qualify for a credit on their property tax because their income is below $37,500. If they are registered for that, we will automatically give them that same $116 return, which should be about 25% of the water bill if they are on the minimum charge, which many people are. About 26% of single-family homeowners get a minimum charge bill. So we think that's a good step. It's not, we don't think, the last thing we hope we will do over the years to try to provide some buffer, but that's a step over the past 2 years that we've introduced. So if you're paying a minimum bill, if you are using 100 gallons a day or less, your bill for the year is $464. And with that, home water assistance program or the senior disabled program, that reduces it to about $348 a year, which is about a third of what you would be paying otherwise if you had a typical single-family home. I need to mention a couple other things because they are part of the rate adoption. The first one is that the minimum charge that I mentioned before for people who use less than 100 gallons a day is going to be frozen. This is the second year it has been frozen, so those people will see no increase in their water bill. I mentioned before 26% of the bills we issue to single-family homes are minimum bills. I mentioned the service line protection program under the agreement. When there's an index and when it goes up a certain amount, they can raise the rates. They are not raising them this year. And finally, we are offering a modest credit for enrolling in e-billing, which not only saves us money, but if people get registered on e-billing and we can give them leak notification, we can anyway. You don't have to pay through e-billing. All you have to do is register online. So back again to that graph that shows the rates over the past few years with a 3.24 proposed increase, and that is the information for submitting testimony or contacting us online. I did want to mention if there's anyone here who is interested in either the HEAP program or the senior or disabled program and don't know if you're registered, if you will give your contact information to Mike Moran, he will check and see if you're registered, help you know how to register if you're not, and make sure then that you're automatically covered under our program. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. We're now going to open up the floor to comments from the public. Again, if you wish to speak and have not signed up yet, please do so at any time at the registration table at front. We ask that you keep your remarks to no more than 5 minutes so that anyone that wants to speak has an opportunity to do so. And the first speaker is Amanda Farias from Councilmember Elizabeth Crowley's office.
Good evening. Increasing water rates is a question of fairness, and Councilmember Elizabeth Crowley calls on this board to abandon this planned increase immediately. The typical single-family home already pays over $1,000 a year in water rates, yet it takes far too long for 311 calls about clogged catch basins to receive the response it deserves. Large areas of Councilmember's district and a significant amount of Queens still experience flooding during major storms because the sewer infrastructure is in need of serious repairs. Each year, the Department of Environmental Protection has managed to increase revenues on the backs of our working families. There are countless residents, businesses, and property owners that may not consume water but depend on the services of the DEP. Yet, the burden of funding the operating and capital costs of the Department of Environmental Protection falls largely on the backs of homeowners. These last few years, the cost of living, especially for homeowners, has been increasingly difficult. The New York City Water Board must find a fairer way to fund operations. The city cannot continue nickel and diming middle-class families and further the economic divide, ultimately pushing so many working families out of New York. I want to thank all the people here today who are speaking out to protest the increase. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Raymond Haskins from Councilman Eric Ulrich's office.
Thank you. My name is Raymond Haskins. I'm Communications Director for Councilman Eric Ulrich. He was going to be here, but he's tied up at a community meeting, so he sends his regrets. Thank you, New York City Water Board Chair Alfonso Carney, DEP Commissioner Lloyd, members of the board for holding these public comment sessions and for welcoming my remarks this evening. This year, the board will consider Mayor de Blasio's proposal to increase water and sewer rates by 3.24%, marking the second consecutive annual increase since the mayor took office. During the previous administration, the water rate rose by 165%, increasing every year, including 4 consecutive double-digit boosts beginning in 2009. If the latest increase is approved, Mr. de Blasio will have overseen a 6.7 increase, including last year's 3.35 boost. Sadly, New Yorkers already shoulder some of the highest tax burdens in the country, and coupled with New York City's exorbitant cost of living and other fines, fees, and regulatory costs, it's becoming increasingly difficult for residents to live and raise a family in the 5 boroughs. It will also point out that this increase is less than what it has been levied in past years. For many New York families, that is not good enough. In addition to representing a district made up of hardworking middle-class families, I speak on behalf of many homeowners whose lives are ravaged from Hurricane Sandy. More than 2 years later, these families are still struggling daily with the high cost of recovery, and this tax increase will make rebuilding that much more difficult for those impacted families. In closing, I'm sure my remarks will echo some of what you've already heard in the other boroughs. I respectfully urge the board to reject this proposal in its current form. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Eve Weiner.
I didn't expect to speak. I thought somebody else would be representing my point of view, but I didn't come across anybody else, so here I am. Partly what I'm going to present, I wrote in a blog earlier this week. I have a blog called Eve's Peeves, so if you missed some of it, you can go read it there. First of all, maybe we'll find you some money, because I'm very much opposed to fluoridating the water in New York City. And nowhere did I hear in this Lloyd's report how much money is being spent to buy fluoride to put into our water. And it's a serious hazard, and it's very bad. So I have 3 points to make on that. Dentists have been faulted because they are putting a lot of mercury into the wastewater. I don't know if you've had anything done recently with me. I had broke a tooth, and a filling, I'm sorry, and I had to go and have it cleaned up so that I could take a trip. And he just flattened it out and then irrigated it and put that in the wastewater. That's what happens with all our fillings. Okay. And apparently dentists put in about 40 metric tons of mercury into our wastewater. And that's a lot. Mercury is a real serious poison. Recently there was an article in the Times, I think it was about, not this past science section, but I think the week before, that the pineal gland is impacted by fluoride, and that it sometimes causes Alzheimer's disease. And also there's research that ADHD is related to the fluoride. There has been research done with 2 communities, and this is all substantiated. I mean, this is not why they're not. Where they tested the children in one where there was fluoride, and then there was one that did not have fluoride, and the children were getting fluoride had lower IQs. I incidentally am a psychologist, and I've been a school psychologist, so I'm aware of that. There's also the compound glyphosate, which is part of Roundup. So the gardeners put this on our lawns, and we end up ingesting it, and it's very bad. And we are also being medicated without our consent. I mean, if you want to drink, I just put in a reverse osmosis filter into I'm a homeowner in Eastern Queens. To get the fluoride out of my water. It's the only way I could do it. It cost me more than $1,000 to do it, to buy the equipment and then have a plumber install it. And I'm really quite old, but it's better late than never. Let me finish with a small anecdote. In the 50s, when we were fighting this, when it first came in, I was part of a reform movement, and we had a Democratic club in Jackson Heights, and we were selecting an assembly person to run. And I interviewed him very closely about what his feelings about this were, because I still feel strongly about it. He did not win the election by 1 vote, so it can carry over, and it has impact. And what we as citizens do, we can stop some of this. And maybe we'll save some money out of this. I never heard in the report that Emily gave what you people are paying for the fluoride to industry. I think it's a waste product. Does anybody know that number?
We pay approximately $2.9 million per year.
Well, that would save some money, wouldn't it? You're spending my money, aren't you? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Robin Warwick.
I'm here to speak about fluoride, but mainly about fluoride. No, that's great. Thank you so much. Thank you for letting me speak again. I spoke a couple of days ago. This time I have a letter from the head of preventative dentistry at the University of Toronto in Toronto, Canada. He has a PhD in biochemistry. He's a practicing dentist who's done years of funded research in tooth formation, bone, and fluoride. He was one of 12 scientists who served on the National Academy of Scientists panel that issued the 2006 report, Fluoride in Drinking Water, a scientific review of the EPA standards. So I think he knows what he's talking about, right? So he has 4 reasons, many more than that, but fluoridation is no longer effective. It's supposed to be topical. It works through toothpaste, not in the water. Fluoridation is the main cause of dental fluorosis, and just recently, right, they dropped it from 0.7 to 1.2. They dropped it, and they can't be more than 0.7 now. They've finally recognized, yes, fluoride causes fluorosis, and the Dental Association thinks that by fluoridated water, it's going to save $38 per person. It actually costs, to fix fluorosis, it costs like at least $850, and that was cheap. And it's not reversible. You can't fix fluorosis. The chemicals that are actually used in fluoridation have not been tested for safety. Fluoride hasn't been passed by the EPA. I mean, it's just not the EPA, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, because fluoride was around before the FDA. The FDA. And it's been kind of grandfathered in, and the drug that they actually put in the water, if I remember how to pronounce it correctly, hexafluorosilicic acid, is actually a toxic waste product from the phosphate industry. It's not pharmaceutical grade fluoride that's put in toothpaste. And all the studies that have been looking at sodium fluoride, which is a naturally occurring substance, and it is in fluoride, but I mean it is in water in some places, but hexafluorosilicic acid is not natural. It's a waste product from various places, including uranium mining, steel industry, oil, industry. It uses fluoride, the fluorine element. And also, last but not least, there are serious health risks from fluoridation, which you mentioned a few of them. There's osteosarcomas, bone cancer, has been recently identified at risk in young boys. Not men older than 30, but in young children. And that was recently published Harvard study by Basin Cancer Causes and Control 2006. So this is not that recent. Bone fractures, adverse thyroid function. Thyroid was a UK study They looked at one area, UK, only 10% of the UK fluoridate the water. 97% of Europeans do not fluoridate the water, yet their dental decay has gone down. America is fluoridated 70%. Millions of people get fluoridated. Thyroid function, back to thyroid function. So in the UK, there's one area not fluoridated, one area was. Twice as many people had hypothyroidism, which is crazy. I'm sorry, that's just so crazy. So many Americans have problems with their thyroid, and in the last 60 years, we've been being polluted with this fluoride. Adverse neurological effects. What happens with fluorine elements? Really, it's an amazing element. It's number, I think number 9 on the element on the chemical table. It's the most electronegative element. It's fantastic in industry. You can melt lead really easily. You can melt all these other things. It does attack the bacteria caused by sugar. That when you eat sugar, that causes caries, dental decay. And so fluorine element does attack the bacteria. It gets through the cells, explodes the cell, the bacteria. But it works topically. And we're swallowing this same element that can get into a cell and damage that cell, we're swallowing and putting into our system. 50% gets retained in our body. The rest of it gets taken out and then put it down into the waste product and then goes through the pipes into the water. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've got some information with me if you want to see me after.
Yes, we will.
Thank you very much. At this point in the meeting, I'd like to open up the floor to any additional comments. Is there anyone in the audience that has not signed up but would like to speak? Yes, ma'am, please, if you wouldn't mind coming to the microphone, introducing yourself.
I just happened to stumble in on this meeting coming out of the class. Could you tell us? My name is Deborah McGurk. I hear everyone talking about the fluoridation of the water, et cetera, Long and short, at this point in my life, I mean, people have been doing a lot of things to the water over the years, so that much is not that important to me right now. What is the rates that are going to become in effect in July. Had no idea, saw nothing in my water bill, not a clue. What is the purpose to raise the rates at this point? I mean, there's been times over the past 5 years we've seen all kind of different coloration in the water stream. You know, in my own house, sometimes people think it's got to do with the copper in the piping or for some whatever reason. Can somebody tell me why we're raising rates? I haven't found yet the percentage and where this money is going.
I'm sorry, were you not here during the commissioner's presentation?
No, I was in a class.
Oh, okay.
I did say when I first came here that I stumbled into this.
Well, the percentage increase is 3.24%, which for the average single-family home is $33 per year, or $275 per month, or 8 cents per day.
Okay.
And the commissioner spent approximately a half hour explaining in great detail why we need the increase.
To no fault of my own.
No, absolutely, but rather than my repeating it for everyone else, perhaps if you could stay a minute, because I think we're about to finish up, and then I will just, if we could talk,
Certainly.
I would be happy to fill you in on
Certainly.
what we are recommending and why.
Okay.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone who has not yet spoken that would like to do so? Ms. Warren?
Can I ask you about you said 2.6 million for the fluoride?
Yes. 2.9.
Because there was a Freedom of Information Act question put out, and I read it was more like 5.2 million in 2009. Is that because it's being reduced since 2009? And also, what about the cost of the corrosion done in the pipes from fluoride? Fluoride's very corrosive, so at the point of entry, there's probably a lot of damage around that, and also the workers that work with it. There's at least 13 full-time and I think 16 part-time, something like that. I might get the numbers mixed up. That's what it was in 2009. Has it changed since then?
I don't know what we spent in 2009. We did reduce the dosage since then. We used to add 1 part per million, and now we're down to 0.8 parts per million. And we spent 2.9 million on the fluoride itself. The process of dosing the fluoride is mostly automated. We don't have personnel dedicated specifically to administering the fluoride. It's part of their job. They do other things to deliver the water to you. It's just part of some of our people's jobs.
So can you clarify how it's put into the water then? I mean, doesn't it come in, it comes in a dry powder and then it gets put into at certain points in the like someone's going to have to take it off the truck because it doesn't get it from somewhere, right? Where does the fluoride come from?
Right, so we could, if you want to, we can give you a fuller explanation offline. We can connect you with someone in our Bureau of Water Supply and they can talk you through the process.
Okay, great, thank you.
Thank you. Before we conclude this hearing, I would like to remind everyone that written remarks can be submitted to the New York City Water Board by mail. The address up there, 5917 Junction Boulevard, the 8th floor, Flushing, New York, 11373. You may also submit written comments by email to nycwaterboard@dep.nyc.gov. As a reminder, please submit your written remarks no later than 5 p.m. this Friday so that they can be sent to the Water Board in advance of their adoption of a rate. Mr. Chairman, since there is no further business,
There is no further business.
this hearing is adjourned. Yeah.